At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the world works. Instead of different empires basically duking it out for populations and resources, we put everything to a big pool and we patrolled the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could play in any part of the world without having to militarize their economy. So they weren't shooting at each other, and that generated the greatest economic growth we have ever seen in the history of our species. Now, we didn't do it because we're nice. We did it because it was a trade. You get globalization, you get free trade, you get access to the American market, and in exchange, the United States gets to write your security policies specifically to contain the Soviet Union. And that trade created the world that we know. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And for each of the last 4 successive presidential administrations in this country, we've moved further and further away. And now, functionally, it's over. Well, where you are, where physically you live is the single greatest factor that determines everything about your life. So if you live in a flatlands where they get ample rainfall, odds are you're very, very food secure, assuming you're not even a farmer. If you live along a river or at a major port, you're probably more integrated with the wider world and you're more culturally open to other ideas. It's one of the reasons why the hinterland in the United States, because it's part of why the hinterland in the United States is a little more conservative than the coasts. If you live in the mountains, you probably really don't like it when other people stick noses in your business, and you're probably fairly insular. And you add up factors like this, everything from your environmental circumstances to a rainfall pattern, to heat patterns, and it shapes who you are. Now, one thing that has changed in the last 80 years is the United States has said it doesn't matter. With the global order, we said that everyone can play. And while some geographies are more economically viable than others, and so generate larger powers that become empires, with the global order, we smashed all of them and allowed everyone to play, no matter how weak the countries were. So it was no longer a world of Japan and Germany and Britain and France. It became a world full of places like Chile and Brazil and Spain and Italy, Libya, Syria, and Vietnam. Without the Americans setting up the world in its current format, none of these small countries would have ever made it. So think of a normal demographic profile as a pyramid. Children on the bottom, young adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. That's how it's looked more or less for the last 6,000 years. More people in their teens than 20s, than 30s, than 40s, than 50s, and 60s. But with the combination of industrialization, urbanization, and now the global order, people have been able to get a bigger chunk out of life for themselves. So they move from the farm into town, they get an apartment. And when space is constrained and you're packed in with a lot of other people, the birth rate drops. So you play that forward 80 years. And in most countries, we now have more people in their 50s than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s, than their 10s, than children. And so the whole world is turned inside out. For the countries that have aged like that, now that it's been decades, they're nearing the point where they have more retirees than workers. And when we hit that flip, their economies change. So if you have a lot of young people, it's all about the consumption. If you have a lot of mature workers, so it's all about the production and the savings. And if you have if you're full of retirees, it's all about absolutely nothing because there's nowhere to grow. So what's going to happen in just the next 5 years is the world writ large flips from having a younger population of consumers and investors to a retiree population. And we have never seen that before in human history. To this point, only one country has crossed the Rubicon, Japan, and the Japanese economy today is the same size that it was in 1995. And no, the one-child policy worked a little too well. And if you use Chinese statistics, which are always dubious and always designed to make China look better than it is, China is now the fastest aging society in human history, and they're already in their population collapse. And there will be less than half as many Chinese in the year 2070 as there are today. They went from a one-child policy to a two-child policy a few years ago, and the birth rate went down. It's too late. They urbanized too quickly. Now, in the United States, our urbanization process has taken 7 generations to get where we are. So we've had time to adapt, and we have space for things like suburbs, so you can still have more than 2.1 children if you want to. That's not an option in China. They moved 3/4 of their population off the farm and into the cities in 35 years. So it's a single generation jump and it just destroyed the birth.
And of course, your openness towards immigration, whether you're the United States or China, which certainly is not very open to immigration.
Well, the first piece is demographic. They're now the fastest aging society in history. When they tried to go from the one-child policy to the two-child policy, their birth rate dropped because everybody was already in an apartment. It's been the fastest industrialization and the fastest urbanization in history. It generates growth once, and now it's over. We stretched our experience over 7 decades. They did theirs in 1, and it was fun while it lasted. Now it's gone. The Chinese Navy is constrained by the first island chain, and those are those islands off the coast of East Asia, so Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and so on. Except when the Americans are running the show and they force everyone to be on the same side. So if the Americans leave, that doesn't work. Because the Chinese demography is in free fall, they're completely dependent on exports, which makes them economically the country in the world most dependent upon ongoing American involvement. This is a country that has almost mined out all of their resources, which makes them the single largest purchaser of every raw commodity in the world. But that requires open markets that are going away. This is a country that imports 80% of its energy, over half of which comes from the Persian Gulf and sales by no fewer than 11 countries that are pathologically hostile to the Chinese, not to mention that the Japanese have a blue water navy and China doesn't. There's nothing about this that works unless the United States holds up the ceiling. And we're done. What we're seeing in Hong Kong and the genocide out in Xinjiang, they're preparing their system for a Maoist-style cultural revolution, political and economic disconnect from the rest of humanity. It's going to be ugly. It's going to result in the deaths of literally hundreds of millions of people. But the Communist Party is hopeful that if they can demonize the outside world enough. Sure, so the entire purpose of the Cold War globalized order was to pay other countries to be on our side to contain the Soviets. It worked well. So the Soviets have always been leery of American leadership, especially when it comes to economic matters, because they just see it as a ploy to box them in, and they're not entirely wrong. Understand why they're paranoid. Oftentimes, Russian paranoia actually is rooted in a degree of fact, certainly in this case. But this is a country that doesn't have a good internal transport network. All the navigable rivers flow north into the Arctic, not any place where anyone would want to go. And the land is dry and the land is cold. So it's not very productive from an agricultural point of view. So Russia has always needed external investment and external technology in order to make its own system work at anything other than like a serfdom level. That's not really an option, especially when you look at their demographics. And between World War I and World War II and Soviet collectivization and the purges and the forced relocations and the post-Cold War health collapse, Russia had the fastest aging society in the world until Japan passed them a few years ago. So this is a country that is also on its way out. Now, it doesn't have the economic vulnerabilities that China has. Because the Russians never invested their economy in the global system, when the global system goes away, they're more or less all right. Sure, they will lose resource sales, but militarily, they're in a reasonably good position. The problem is it's not good enough. Because the terrain is so open, Russian history is replete with examples of countries basically rolling in and invading. We know about the Germans, we know about the Swedes, we know about the Chinese, we know about the Persians and the Mongols, but people forget that countries like Canada invaded Russia at one point. I mean, it's not a hard place to get a foothold in. Poland almost conquered Moscow once. So while no one is thinking, oh, I want to march on Moscow right now, the Russians can't take that chance because it's happened so many times before. So if you've got a terminal demography and no real economy, the only thing that you can do to buy yourself more time is take your army while it's still functional and forward position it and plug the geographic gaps that access your lands. So the Carpathians form a border. You anchor there. But that means conquering Ukraine and half of Poland and the Balts. You go south and anchor in the Tianjin, but that means conquering Kazakhstan and the Central Asian republics. So this is something that Russia can do and is working on doing with as much diplomacy and arm